On the small Norwegian island called Leka off the rugged coast of Namdalen sits one of Norway's largest burial mounds. And for centuries, local legend held that this was the resting place of Herlaug, who would have been a pre-Viking king, who according to a 13th century saga chose to be sealed alive inside the mound rather than submit to the conquering king Harald Fairhair. The truth about this mound is, however, even more exciting than the story. The legend was compelling enough to inspire excavations as far back as 1755. These early diggers found some stuff, like a skeleton or parts of it, a sword, some iron nails, and also animal bones, and all of this was chalked up as confirmation of the myth that was largely forgotten. But then in 2023, archaeologists came back with better tools and also better questions, and what we know about this mound may turn out more electrifying than the legend. So this region, Namdalen, was relatively poor in terms of agriculture. However, it did and does have natural resources like fish and sea mammals, and also extensive forested areas with a wealth of game timber and bog iron ore. Together with parts of the Trondheim fjord to the south, Namdalen has a dense concentration of boat burials, mostly with date ranges from 700 to 1050. The saga describes how the brothers Herlaug and Herlaug, who were kings in Namdalen, built this huge mound. And to escape submitting to King Harald, who was also himself a semi mythical, semi historical unifier of Viking Age Norway, Herlaug entered the mound with this vast quantity of food and sealed it behind him. And on the other hand, Herlaug submitted to Harald. The 2023 team from the University of Science and Technology from Trondheim and Trøndelag County had two clear goals: to find physical evidence of the ship and then to pin down when the mound was actually built. And they did succeed on both counts because they discovered 29 iron rivets, quite large, and well preserved clinker nails. They recovered them from a central trench. So we're basically dealing with the fasteners used to join the overlapping planks of a clinker built ship's hull. The size told a very interesting story. We're not really dealing with a modest vessel as we would probably imagine in such a remote place so far up north. In fact, it seems to be comparable to the much more famous Gokstad and Oseberg ships because the nails suggest a ship of over 20 meters in length. Some of the rivets even preserved fragments of wood, either oak or elm, still clinging to the iron after more than 1300 years. Radiocarbon dating of the wood and charcoal samples delivered quite an unexpected result, namely that the mound dates to about 700, placing it at the very end of the 7th century or at the beginning of the 8th. So this makes Herlagshaugen one of the earliest ship burials in Scandinavia, predating the Western Norwegian ship graves on Karmøy by roughly a century. Now, why is this so significant? Well, before this discovery, we were facing a very awkward chronological gap because the earliest known ship burials were in fact Anglo Saxon. We have the example of Snape, not the Snape, not the original Snape either, but I'm talking about the ship burial from Suffolk, dated to about 550 or 600, and also the iconic Sutton Hoo, dated back to approximately, yeah, again, 600 or 625. So they're both in East Anglia. On the other hand, Scandinavia's famous ship mounds, they didn't really appear until the late 8th and 9th centuries. So the two traditions look like they might be unrelated or at best very loosely connected. Herlagshaugen seems to plug that gap in a way. We have a seagoing ship buried under a monumental mound in northern Norway in about 700, and this suggests that the practice of these grand ship burials wasn't really an invention of the Viking Age, but rather part of a continuous pan-North Sea cultural tradition that stretched from East Anglia to Scandinavia across the 7th and 8th centuries. The two traditions were almost certainly in conversation with one another. On the other hand, there is elusive evidence of contact, direct contact between Norway and the British Isles in the migration period, so before the Viking Age, but they would have shared, in a way, a certain cultural milieu. The mound itself measures 62 meters in diameter and originally around 12 meters tall. It was a tomb, but it was also kind of like a statement. Leka occupied a strategic position along the ancient coastal sailing route known as the Norveger, so Norway, quite literally the way to the north. So anyone traveling up or down the Norwegian coast would have sailed through the strait beside Leka, where they would have seen Herlog's Haugen. It would have loomed into view from the water. And this means that it was sort of like a dominant point in the landscape. It was very difficult to miss. Some local place names reinforce this whole picture. We have the farm where the mound sits, called Skei, associated with markets and competitive gatherings, and also Leknes, likely derived from the Old Norse word leker, which means games, many of which are communal games at assemblies. A nearby site was even called Tinghaugen, literally the Thing Mound, clearly hinting at a tradition of legal assemblies on the island. So it seems like an organized place, a place that was connected with the wider area. And we also have the accounts of the travels of Ottar or Othir, the Viking-age explorer and trader from Hålogaland, the northernmost part of Norway, in the 9th century, which reveal trade from the north and also much further south. So we can consider Leka a node in a regional network, meaning this place where trade goods, political power, authority, cultural exchange all converge. The leader buried in the mound likely built their authority through what in scholarship is called the maritime mode of production, which is also a term used for the Bronze Age, meaning this blend of raiding, trading, and control over sea routes and resources as directly as possible, characterizing the emerging elites of the pre-Viking age. So this is when chieftains, local chieftains, and societies became more territorial and also much more hierarchical. Furthermore, the charcoal layers found in the upper portion of the mound are very intriguing because they might represent subsequent cremation burials added to the mound after the original ship burial. And this is a practice we do see at other Norwegian sites. If so, Herlagshaugen wasn't just one act of commemoration, but we can rather consider it a living monument that accumulated meanings over generations. This is a very fascinating aspect. Adding new burials to existing mounds or building new mounds in direct spatial relation to older ones, this would have served to create a chain of monumental episodes. So, this practice tried to materialize the history of a social group, linking the present community to their predecessors through a physical sequence of monuments. Even if the original builders were forgotten, the presence of an ancient monument provided sort of like a stage to evoke connections to mythical ancestors or even supernatural beings. So it goes beyond this idea of building mounds just for the sake of political legitimacy or territorial claims. That accumulated meaning is precisely what made it attractive to later myth makers and storytellers. By the time Snorri Sturluson wrote down the saga of Harald Fairhair in the 13th century in his History of the Kings of Norway in Heimskringla, Herlagshaugen had been a landmark for half a millennium. And this is something we don't really think about very often, that for medieval people living in the 13th, 14th century, this would have been the ancient past. I mean, 700 AD is quite a temporal distance, even for medieval people. The legend of the king who sealed himself inside rather than submit to a conqueror was, probably not a memory of a real event, but rather a story grown around a monument that was so old and so impressive that it really demanded an explanation, even a folkloristic and more or less supernatural one. The 2023 excavation at Herlagshaugen definitely adds another very important entry to the catalogue of Scandinavian ship burials, but at the same time, it also reshapes our understanding of an entire era because it shows that the impulse to bury leaders in ships beneath these towering mounds as an expression of maritime power, an expression of legitimacy, and also ambitions, dynastic ambitions, was very much alive in northern Norway as well, kind of like a century earlier than previously thought. And this whole thing was part of this broader cultural tradition that stretched across the North Sea to Anglo-Saxon England. The mound still guards many of its secrets: the ship itself, the identity of the buried leader, the full story of those charcoal layers. These all remain beneath the sand and stone for the time being. What was found is enough to confirm that history was being made even on remote Norwegian islands. If you enjoyed this topic, brace yourselves because apparently I love talking about burial mounds now. And there is more similar stuff on the channel, including a podcast called Mounds and Memory, where you can learn more about the mound called Raknehaugen, the mound of King Rakni. Thank you so much for watching or listening. This was Irina, and if you want to support the channel, please consider a membership as well. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.